Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. If someone told me I'd battle a rogue HOA I never joined for a house I fully owned, I'd have laughed. But one lock change, a $560,000 fine, and a forged map later, I found myself in a courtroom war that exposed fraud, toppled an empire, and changed everything. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd end up fighting a homeowners association I never joined for a house I fully own, I'd have laughed it off as a bad sitcom plot. Back then, my only goal was simple: peace and privacy. After a decade of working as a software engineer, mostly from sterile offices and loud co-working spaces, I was ready for something real. Quiet mornings, open skies, and a place I could call mine without someone breathing down my neck about paint. Colors or mailbox designs. That's how I ended up in the foothills outside of town buying my dream property, a 5-acre spread with a modest but beautiful 2-story farmhouse, a weathered detached garage, and a garden already half wild and blooming. It sat well apart from any main road, bordered by old oaks and a natural creek that cut across the back. It was, in every possible sense, freedom. No neighbors within shouting distance, no noise, no streetlights, and, most importantly, no HOA. When I signed the papers, I double-checked that detail at least 3 times. I even had my lawyer pull county zoning records just to be absolutely sure. The last thing I wanted was some committee dictating what kind of mulch I could use or how many lawn chairs were too many. The sellers were an older couple who'd lived there since the 80s, and they confirmed it had always been outside any association's reach. Just pure, unregulated land. That was the deal. Of course, about a quarter-mile down the road, there was a newer development called Silver Ridge. Cookie-cutter homes in soft beige tones, a clubhouse, perfectly groomed lawns, and smiling people jogging in sync like they'd rehearsed it. The kind of place I intentionally avoided. Still, they stayed on their side of the hill. And I stayed on mine. For almost 2 years, we coexisted without incident. Then the neighborhood elected a new HOA president. Her name was Karen Grayson. I didn't know it yet, but that single change was about to unravel everything. I'd only been gone for 4 days. A quick work trip. Nothing major, just a client in Seattle who wanted an in-person whiteboard session instead of another Zoom call. I left on a Monday morning and came back Thursday afternoon, expecting to find my house exactly the way I left it. Quiet, undisturbed, and waiting for me with that familiar smell of pine wood and coffee. Instead, I found chaos. The first red flag hit me the second I pulled into the driveway. My gate, normally locked and latched, was slightly ajar. At first, I told myself maybe it hadn't closed properly, maybe wind, maybe a delivery guy didn't secure it. But then I noticed the tire tracks, fresh ones leading up toward the garage. That made no sense. I hadn't authorized any work. I hadn't told anyone I'd be away. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. The front door was damaged. Not just scratched or bumped. The frame had been splintered, the lock replaced. Someone had broken into my house and installed a new lock. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to wrap my head around it. Then I reached for the hidden key box by the porch. Empty. I had no key to this new lock, and I sure as hell hadn't asked anyone to install it. I circled to the back and forced open the mudroom entrance, one that, thank God, hadn't been tampered with. The interior was worse. My office had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, files scattered. The dining table was covered in papers stamped with some kind of official seal. And right there, in the center, was a printed notice from the Silver Ridge HOA, signed by Karen Grayson herself. It read like something from a dystopian legal drama. According to them, I owed $560,000 in fines for unauthorized structural modifications, non-compliant landscaping, and, get this, unregistered occupancy. The final line claimed my property had been temporarily seized under internal community protocol. I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. I wasn't part of any HOA. My deed said nothing about them. This was my land, my house, and someone had just walked in and claimed it, like they were the damn sheriff. Something inside me snapped. Whatever this was, it was war. I didn't even bother cleaning up the mess. I went straight to my security system console, practically shaking as I typed in my credentials and pulled up the footage from the outdoor and indoor cameras. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'm not sure I would have believed it myself. There they were, 5 people marching down my driveway in broad daylight, bold as hell. Karen Grayson led the pack, wearing a dark blue blazer with a shiny HOA badge clipped to the lapel, like she was some kind of federal agent. Behind her were two men in matching polo shirts with the Silver Ridge HOA logo stitched across the chest, and two women carrying clipboards and duffel bags. One of them had a crowbar. At exactly 11:07 a.m., they broke the front lock, on camera, and walked in like they owned the place. Karen stood in the living room pointing like a director on a movie set, while the others fanned out. They rifled through my home office, filmed the garage, opened drawers, and even took photos of my tax files. At one point, Karen picked up a framed photo of my parents, scoffed, and put it down like it offended her. I hit pause and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I gave them everything: my name, address, what I'd come home to, and that I had video evidence of an organized break-in. The operator's tone shifted immediately. Within 15 minutes, two patrol cars rolled up my driveway. I met them outside and played the footage from my tablet. The officers exchanged looks, serious ones, and told me to wait while they assessed the scene. And then, as if summoned by chaos itself, Karen showed up. Again. She pulled up in a spotless black SUV, stepped out with that same smugness I'd seen in the video, and strutted toward the officers like she was walking into a staff meeting. "This man is an unregistered occupant," she declared. "He's not in compliance with our HOA code. We were forced to secure the property to initiate enforcement." The officers turned to me. I silently handed over my deed, registration, zoning documents, and even the original closing paperwork from my lawyer, all of which clearly stated no HOA affiliation, never had, never will. But the clincher was the footage. I handed the tablet to one of the officers. He watched silently as Karen gave the order to break in. His brow furrowed. His partner quietly stepped aside and called in backup. Karen, now clearly sensing things were going sideways, tried to regain control. "This is being blown out of proportion. We followed protocol. He's mistaken about his exclusion from the community. Our maps." The officer cut her off. "Ma'am, you're not a law enforcement entity. You don't have the right to forcibly enter private property, especially one not under your jurisdiction." Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted toward the second officer, who was now taking photos of the doorframe and interviewing the neighbors who'd gathered at the edge of my driveway. The tide had turned, and I wasn't letting it go. The next morning, I sat across from Laura Mills, a property rights attorney with the kind of no-nonsense attitude you pray for in moments like this. Her office overlooked downtown, lined with thick law books and framed verdicts. She barely blinked as I laid out the documents and showed her the footage. If anything, she looked energized. "You're not just dealing with trespassing," she said flatly. "This is attempted property fraud, possibly extortion. And that fine they slapped on you? That's straight-up attempted theft. I'd barely slept the night before. The weight of the break-in, the absurd fine, the possibility of someone trying to take what I legally owned, it had spun around my head nonstop. But now, listening to Laura talk with absolute clarity, I finally felt grounded. I wasn't crazy. This wasn't some misunderstanding. It was an attack. Within hours, Laura had filed a formal cease and desist against Silver Ridge HOA and Karen Grayson, citing illegal entry, harassment, and unauthorized seizure of private property. Then came the real weapon, a civil lawsuit aimed directly at Karen and the HOA board, alleging criminal trespass, coercion, attempted conversion of property, and emotional distress. Karen, of course, fired back within days. She and her lawyers doubled down. Their response claimed my house had been absorbed into Silver Ridge HOA territory via a revised boundary map passed through internal vote. The map, dated 2 years prior, showed my property neatly tucked within their borders. According to them, I had been subject to their regulations all along and was simply in denial or misinformed. Laura wasn't fazed. She dug deeper, requested discovery on the HOA's records, and subpoenaed meeting minutes, voting logs, and internal memos. What came back was even worse than we expected. The map? Backdated. The vote? Held in private with no public notice. Several board members hadn't even been aware of it. And the real kicker, Karen had signed off on the whole thing herself, as both president and supposed land use chair, a position that didn't even exist until a month before the incident. "This isn't just illegal," Laura muttered, flipping through the records. "This is textbook fraud, and she's dumb enough to leave a paper trail." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had picked the wrong property and the wrong guy. The more we pulled back the curtain, the more rot we found behind it. Laura brought in Dan Reyes, a veteran county surveyor with 30 years under his belt, to settle the most crucial question. Had my land ever, in any official capacity, been annexed into Silver Ridge HOA? Dan spent 2 days combing through county plat maps, zoning archives, subdivision approvals, everything from the original land patents to the most recent land use filings. When he showed up to our meeting, he dropped a manila folder on Laura's desk and simply said, "Nope, not even close." According to his analysis, the Silver Ridge development was platted 5 years ago with explicit exclusion of my parcel, which had been registered separately since the 1940s. The HOA's boundary stopped nearly 300 feet from my western fence. Nothing had changed. No annexation, no easement, no realignment. The so-called updated map that Karen had submitted, not only was it unofficial, it wasn't even filed with the county. It was a Photoshop job printed on office paper. It didn't stop there. Laura hired a forensic document examiner, a quiet woman named Trina Park, who could look at ink strokes like a crime scene. She took one look at the signatures on the HOA integration resolution Karen submitted to justify her actions and immediately flagged 3 discrepancies. 2 signatures, she explained, had been copied from older documents and slightly altered, and the third, flat out forged, she said. Not even close to the board member's actual signature. Meanwhile, we subpoenaed financial records. That's when things really exploded. Karen had created a special enforcement fund, allegedly to cover legal action and fines associated with non-compliant properties. On paper, it sounded like a slush fund for neighborhood improvement. In reality, it was a personal bank account registered in her name under the alias SR Compliance Escrow LLC. All fines collected, including those imposed on me, had been routed directly to her. Laura nearly choked on her coffee when she read the report. We gathered sworn statements from 2 former HOA board members, both of whom claimed they'd raised concerns months earlier, but were shut down or ignored. One of them, an elderly man named Tom Acker, told us flatly she was acting like the queen of the subdivision. We just stopped going to the meetings. It wasn't worth the fight. Now, with mounting evidence and sworn testimony, Laura filed a motion to add fraud, financial misconduct, and conspiracy to our case. The court granted it without hesitation. The tide had turned, and Karen Grayson, once the untouchable HOA president, was about to find herself stripped of every illusion of power she ever clung to. Court began on a Monday morning under a sky so perfectly clear it almost felt staged. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Laura, dressed in a navy blazer she had insisted on. "You're not just a guy defending your home, you're the voice of every homeowner who's ever been pushed around by an HOA," she'd told me. Across the aisle, Karen Grayson sat flanked by a trio of attorneys, lips pressed into a hard line, eyes defiant. She wore the same HOA badge she'd been so proud of, though this time it looked more like a costume than a symbol of authority. Opening arguments were quick, but then came the evidence. A parade of facts that stripped away every defense Karen had left. First came Dan Reyes, the county surveyor. He walked the jury through maps spanning decades, showing clearly where Silver Ridge ended and where my land had always stood completely independent. Then came Trina, the handwriting expert, methodically dismantling the legitimacy of the so-called integration resolution with a laser pointer and a calm, devastating confidence. Karen's defense team tried to pivot. They claimed she had acted in good faith, that she had relied on interpretations provided by the HOA's advisory board, and that any discrepancies were technical oversights. But that argument shattered when Laura called Detective Reynolds, a property crimes investigator who had been reviewing the banking trail. He presented transaction after transaction, tracing thousands of dollars from HOA accounts into Karen's compliance escrow fund. The account wasn't just illegal, it was barely hidden. The tipping point came when we played the security footage in court. There, projected larger than life for the jury and everyone in the room, was Karen Grayson standing in front of my house, giving orders to break down the front door. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no plausible deniability. And then Laura did what I didn't expect. She called Karen to the stand. Watching her climb into the witness box, fidget under oath, and attempt to explain away what the jury had just seen with their own eyes was surreal. She deflected, she stammered, and finally, under pressure, she snapped. She accused me of antagonizing the neighborhood, of exploiting legal loopholes, and, my favorite, of refusing to be a good citizen. Laura didn't need to say much after that. The jury had seen enough. So had the judge. An hour later, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Civil liability for fraud, trespassing, extortion, and emotional damages. And then the judge did something unexpected. He called for a sheriff's deputy to approach the bench. Karen Grayson was arrested right there in the courtroom. Handcuffed in front of the jury she had tried to fool. Her lawyers stood frozen. She tried to speak, but the judge silenced her with a raised hand and a curt order. You are no longer a representative of anything but yourself, and you have betrayed both the law and your community. As the gavel came down, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief, deep and real. Justice wasn't just an abstract idea. I had watched it walk into the room and take its place at the front of the bench. The sentence came a week later, and even though I had every reason to expect justice, nothing could have prepared me for how final and powerful it felt when the judge read it aloud. Karen Grayson, once the self-proclaimed steward of community order, was sentenced to 3 years in state prison for fraud, criminal trespassing, and attempted conversion of private property. The courtroom was silent as the bailiff led her away. Her face pale and trembling, stripped of every ounce of smug composure she once wore like armor. She didn't look back at me. I don't think she could. 2 of her so-called inspectors, Greg Fallon and Lisa Meyer, received 18 months of probation, reduced due to cooperation during the investigation. Both had admitted under oath that they followed Karen's orders despite knowing full well they had no legal basis for the break-in. They testified that Karen had used intimidation and manipulation, threatening to blacklist them from the HOA community management industry if they didn't help enforce the vote. Their careers were over. But the hammer didn't fall only on the individuals. The Silver Ridge HOA itself came under full judicial scrutiny. The judge ruled that its internal governance had become systemically compromised by a culture of fraud and intimidation and ordered it dissolved, effective immediately. Control over community maintenance and infrastructure was handed over to a county-appointed transition committee, pending the establishment of an entirely new volunteer-led neighborhood council under oversight. The civil judgment in my case set a precedent. I was awarded $2.4 million in damages, a number I still have trouble wrapping my head around. It covered everything: repairs to my home, new security systems, legal fees, emotional stress, and the calculated value of the fraudulent lien Karen attempted to place against my title. The amount wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. It told every HOA across the state, you don't get to play God with other people's homes. The local media caught wind of the story, and soon, national outlets followed. Headlines flashed. HOA president convicted after breaking into non-member's home. $560K fine overturns in landmark HOA abuse case. Software engineer wins $2.4 million in fight for property rights. I was invited to speak at a town hall organized by another county dealing with overzealous HOA tactics. I turned it down at first, but when a retired couple from Silver Ridge stopped by my gate one afternoon, tears in their eyes, and thanked me for freeing them, I realized it wasn't just my fight anymore. What hit hardest, though, was when I learned that Karen had been under quiet investigation for over a year, not just for my case, but for a half-dozen others where she had levied outrageous fines, altered landscaping reports, and even harassed widowed homeowners. I wasn't her first victim. I was just the first one who had the tools and the stubbornness to push back hard enough. One afternoon, about a month after the sentencing, I received a letter from a young woman in Texas who had read about my story online. Her HOA had been threatening her with liens for faded mailbox paint and insufficient fence uniformity. She ended the letter with, "I'm fighting now, because you did." I never asked to be a symbol. I just wanted my house, my land, my peace. But the fight brought something bigger. Accountability not just for Karen, but for a system that had long gone unchecked. And I wasn't done yet. It took months to put the house back together. The repairs weren't just physical, though there were plenty of those. Replacing the busted door frame, repainting the scratched walls, restoring the drawers and shelves that had been rifled through like a raid. I upgraded everything: locks, lighting, motion sensors, even added reinforced steel cores to the front and back doors. A local veteran-owned company installed the security system and left me with a wink and a handshake. Word had clearly gotten around. But there was something deeper I had to rebuild too. My sense of safety. The idea that my home was mine, that when I turned the key and stepped through the threshold, I was stepping into peace. That took longer. There were nights I still jolted awake at the sound of a twig snapping outside or headlights sweeping past the window, but over time, that anxiety faded. It didn't vanish, but it softened, like scar tissue. A few weeks after the court's final ruling, I installed a brushed steel plaque next to my front door, small, cleanly cut, engraved with sharp lettering. This property is not part of any HOA. Entry without legal warrant will be prosecuted. Next to it, framed and mounted just above eye level, I placed the clipping from the Tribune. HOA president sentenced in landmark property fraud case. $560K fine thrown out. Victim awarded 2 went for worse. Neighbors started stopping by. Some brought cookies. Others brought questions. A few just stood silently in the driveway, hands in pockets, nodding like they'd come to see a memorial. Silver Ridge was a quieter place now, without Karen, without the HOA's constant threats. There was talk of reorganizing into a voluntary association, one that actually listened. I wished them luck. As for me, I went back to work, coding, building out a home automation startup I'd put on pause during the chaos. Only now, between sprints and software releases, I found myself writing something else. A guide, part personal story, part legal roadmap. How to fight back. How to protect your home when systems fail you. It went viral. A month later, I was invited to speak at a national HOA reform conference in Denver. This time, I went. I stood in front of a room full of homeowners, lawyers, journalists, and a few newly elected local officials, and I told them everything. Not just what happened, but why it mattered. I ended with this. A home isn't just where you sleep, it's where you protect what's yours. And no badge, no map, no self-appointed authority has the right to break through your door unless the law is with them. The room stood, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like more than just a guy who got lucky in court. I felt like I'd earned my peace, and I was finally home.